Rock Ridge, winter of 1881. The snow was still falling, and Maeve Thorne was staring at a contract that put her name next to the word property. Sign it. Garrow set the pen on the counter, his voice flat and cold. Or you lose everything. Maeve didn't move. Cracked hands. A bruise still yellow on her jaw, but her eyes didn't flinch. Then the door swung open. She's not a piece of livestock for you to bargain over. Gideon Blackwood stepped inside. Starting right now, she's coming home with me. This is their story. Don't look away. The wind came down off the mountains before sunrise. It didn't ease in. It hit Rock Ridge all at once, driving snow sideways through the gaps in the buildings, rattling every loose board on every storefront along Main Street. By the time most folks were pulling quilts up to their chins, Maeve Thorne had already been awake for 2 hours. 4 o'clock, same as every morning. She stood on the back porch of the general store, her hands wrapped around the rope handles of 2 wooden buckets. The water inside had gone cold somewhere between the pump and the porch, and now a thin skin of ice floated on top. Her fingers had stopped hurting about a week ago. They'd gone past hurting into something else entirely, a deep, dull numbness that lived under her skin all winter long. She hauled both buckets through the back door. The store was dark. She didn't light a lamp right away. She knew every inch of that floor by feel the warped plank near the flour barrels, the low beam above the pickle shelf, the exact spot where the wood stove door swung out and could take your kneecap clean off if you weren't watching. She'd learned all of it the hard way. Bruises teach fast. She set the buckets down, knelt by the stove, and stuffed in a handful of dry bark, then a few splits of pine. She struck a match. The fire caught slowly, like it wasn't sure it wanted to bother. She stayed crouched there for a moment, just letting the small flame breathe. 20 years old. That was her whole life, this store, this stove, this cold. She stood up and got to work. By 5 o'clock, she had the fire roaring, the floor swept, and 2 50-pound grain sacks dragged from the storeroom out to the front shelves. Her boots left wet prints across the wood she'd just swept. She swept it again. Then she filled the display bins cornmeal, dried beans, barley, measuring each one level, the way her father had taught her. He'd been particular about the bins, said. Customers trusted a store that looked cared for. Her father had been gone 3 years now. The wagon accident, they called it. A wet road, a steep hill, a wheel that gave way. That was the story Gertrude told, and the town believed it because there was no reason not to. Who questions a grieving widow? Maeve had questions. She just hadn't had the right evidence yet. She was still arranging the tobacco tins on the back shelf when she heard the floorboards overhead creak. Heavy, slow footsteps. Donald getting up. Her shoulders pulled in slightly, not much, just enough. A habit she'd developed the same way you develop a callus. Repeated contact with something rough until your body learns to brace. He came down the stairs in his union suit and boots, hair mashed flat on one side. He looked at the store at Maeve and said nothing useful. He rarely did. Coffee, he said. She already had it on. He dropped into the chair behind the counter, picked up yesterday's newspaper, and ignored her. That was the better version of Donald. The worse version came out when things didn't go his way, or when Garrow's name came up, or when he'd had too much to drink the night before. This morning he seemed merely useless. So Maeve kept her mouth shut and kept working. Gertrude came down at 6. She was a tall woman who had once been handsome, and now she wore that old handsomeness like a coat she couldn't button anymore. Her eyes were sharp and darting, always calculating, always looking for the next threat to her comfort. She looked at Maeve the way you'd look at a tool left out in the rain. Annoyed it was there, annoyed it might be rusting. The front windows got frost on the inside, Gertrude said. I'll get to it. You'll get to it now. Garrow's coming this morning? Maeve set down the crate of tinned peaches she was carrying. She picked up a rag from the bucket by the door and went to the window. The frost came off in long streaks. Outside, Main Street was still gray and empty, the snow blowing in low sheets across the road. Phineas Garrow. She'd heard that name her whole life. He owned the cattle operation on the east side of the valley, the largest one in this part of the territory. He owned shares in the bank. He owned the ear of the marshal. He didn't exactly own the town, he was too careful for that, but he had his hands in enough places that it amounted to the same thing. He had started coming around about 6 months after her father died. Maeve rubbed the last of the frost from the glass and stood there a moment, watching the empty street. She had been 12 when her father remarried. Gertrude had seemed reasonable then, or at least not cruel. The cruelty came later, in layers, the way cold weather sets in. First the small things, no seat at the family table, no say in any decision, no access to the money her father had saved. Then the larger things, once her father was gone, and there was no one to push back. Now she hauled the water. She swept the floors. She managed the ledgers, priced the inventory, handled the accounts, and received nothing for it. No wages, no acknowledgement, no future she could see from where she stood. But she saw other things. Numbers, mostly. She had her father's head for them. Garrow arrived at 9. Man at 9, he rode in with 2 men behind him, which he always did not because he needed protection, but because the sight of men at your back changed how people talked to you. He was 50, broad through the chest, with a thick gray mustache, and the kind of careful dress that said he wanted you to think about his money before you thought about anything else. He wore it well. Maeve hated how well he wore it. He came through the door and took the room in with one slow look, the way a man assesses livestock at auction. Gertrude. He nodded at her stepmother. Then his gaze moved to Maeve, and it settled there a beat too long. Girl Maeve didn't respond. She went back to stacking tins. He and Gertrude moved to the far end of the counter and began to talk in low voices. Maeve kept her back to them and her ears open. She was good at that. Years of practice. The words she caught were the ones she expected. Debt, the store, terms. Then a phrase that made her hands slow on the shelf, live-in arrangement. She set a tin down carefully and did not turn around. Garrow's voice rose just enough for her to catch the shape of it. He wasn't asking. He was informing. The debt Gertrude had signed onto whatever Garrow said it was had come due. He wanted the store deed, and he wanted Maeve. Not as an employee, something else. Something with no clean word, in polite company, dressed up in language about household management and financial resolution, and clearing the family's obligations. Maeve's jaw tightened. She kept stacking tins, methodically, one after another. Her hands were steadier than she felt, which was the trick. You kept your hands busy and your face blank, and you filed everything away. For later. She'd learned that too. Knowledge was the one thing they hadn't found a way to take from her yet. Garrow said something she didn't catch, and Gertrude laughed. A short, relieved sound, like a woman who'd been carrying a weight for a long time and just handed it to someone else. Maeve placed the last tin on the shelf and stepped back. Her reflection showed faint in the dark glass of the window behind the counter. She looked at it for just a second. Chapped hands. A bruise on her left jaw, fading yellow now from last week. Her father's dark eyes staring back at her. She picked up the empty crate and walked to the storeroom without being told. There was a ledger hidden behind the false back panel her father had built into the shelving. She'd found it 8 months ago, and every night since, by lamplight, after everyone was asleep, she'd been working her way through it, page by page, column by column. The numbers told a story Garrow and Gertrude didn't know she could read. A woman who can audit a ledger is a woman who can build a case. And Maeve had been building hers quietly, carefully, for longer than anyone in that store bothered to notice. She set the crate down. She pressed her hand flat against the shelf panel for just a moment. Then she went back out front and got back to work. The wind kept howling. The snow kept coming, and Phineas Garrow kept talking, like the world owed him everything in it. Maeve swept the floor again and waited. The store closed at 8. Gertrude locked the front door herself, which she only did when Garrow had been by. Something about his visits made her particular, checking the bolt twice, pulling the curtain tight across the window, like she was protecting something, or hiding it. Maeve washed the supper dishes, banked the stove, and swept the back room floor for the 3rd time that day. Nobody asked her to. She did it because moving kept her mind from going to dark places, and because stillness in this house had a way of inviting trouble. Donald had gone out to the saloon an hour ago. Gertrude went upstairs shortly after, complaining about her knees. The house went quiet. Maeve waited 20 minutes, just to be sure. Then she lit the small oil lamp, not the big one, never the big one after dark, because the light would show under the door, and she pulled the ledger out from behind the shelf panel. She set it on the work table in the storeroom and sat down on a crate. Her father's handwriting covered the first half of the book in careful, steady columns: dates, amounts, names of creditors, notes in the margin. He'd been meticulous. That was the word for it. He took the same care with numbers that he took with everything else: slow, deliberate, nothing wasted. She had his handwriting in her bones. She'd practiced it as a girl, sitting beside him at this same table while he walked her through the accounts. Always know where the money is, Maeve. Always. A person who understands money can't be lied to as easily. She turned to the page she'd marked with a strip of brown paper: his bank loans. She'd been working backward through them for weeks, cross-referencing every entry against the receipts she'd found folded into the back cover. Some of them were water-stained, some torn at the edges, but they were there. Her father had kept everything. She ran her finger down the column, adding figures in her head, and then she found it: the final payment, dated 14 months before his death, stamped with the bank's seal. A full settlement of the outstanding balance on the property, loan the store, the land under it, all of it. Paid off. Done. Signed by the branch manager himself. Her father had cleared his debt entirely. She sat very still. She turned back to the page where Gertrude's signature appeared, a cramped, slanted scrawl on a contract. She clearly hadn't read closely enough. Garrow's name was at the top. The figures he'd cited as the outstanding debt were nearly double what her father's records showed. Numbers pulled from nowhere, dressed up in official-looking language, handed to a frightened widow who didn't know how to read a balance sheet. Gertrude had signed it 6 weeks after the funeral. Maeve pressed her fingers flat against the page. She wasn't angry, not exactly. Anger was a feeling you had when something surprised you, and she'd stopped being surprised by Garrow a long time ago. What she felt was colder than anger, and more useful: the steady certainty of a person who has just found the piece that makes the whole picture clear. Garrow had manufactured the debt, and somewhere in that fact was the reason her father's wagon wheel had failed on a road he'd driven 100 times. She closed the ledger and sat in the lamplight for a while, thinking she would need more than this. A ledger and a handful of old receipts were evidence, but evidence needed a witness, and right now the only person who knew what she knew was sitting alone in a storeroom at 10 o'clock at night. She needed time. She needed the right moment. She needed someone who wouldn't be bought. She put the ledger back behind the panel and went to bed. She didn't sleep much. The next morning was iron gray and bitter. The snow packed hard overnight into something that crunched like broken glass underfoot. Maeve was on the front porch sweeping ice off the steps when she heard the horse, a big roan, solid and dark, picking its way carefully down the center of the street. The man in the saddle was tall. You could see that even from the porch, with a hat pulled low and a sheepskin coat that had seen serious weather. He rode like a man who wasn't in any particular hurry, but wasn't wasting time either. He tied the horse at the post and came up the steps. He stopped when he reached the top, and he looked at her, not past her, the way most customers did when they were already thinking about what they needed from the shelves. He looked straight at her, and his eyes were steady and gray, and took in more than she was comfortable with. His name was Gideon Blackwood. She knew him by reputation. Most people in Rockridge did. He ran cattle out on the western edge of the valley, kept to himself, paid his bills in cash and on time. She'd processed his accounts before, though she'd never spoken to him directly. "Morning," he said. "Morning. Go on in. I'll be right behind you." He nodded and pulled the door open. By the time she came inside and brushed the snow off her coat, he was already at the dry goods shelf, reading labels, with the focused patience of a man who didn't guess at things. She went around behind the counter and pulled out his account ledger. "Mr. Blackwood, what do you need today?" He set 4 tins of coffee on the counter, followed by a block of salt, 2 pounds of dried beef, and a small bottle of liniment. He read out 2 more items from a paper in his coat pocket, and she fetched them from the back shelf. The whole transaction moved quietly. No extra words. She was tallying his total when Donald came down the stairs. He was in a foul mood. She could tell by the footsteps alone, heavy and deliberate, the kind that meant he was already looking for something to land on. He came around the end of the counter and stood too close to her. She kept writing figures in the ledger. "You short the Elkins order again yesterday?" he said. "No, Mrs. Elkins says you did." Mrs. Elkins ordered 4 yards of calico and received for you. I measured it twice. She turned the ledger toward him. "It's right here." He looked at the ledger. He couldn't read the entries well enough to argue the point, which made him angrier. She watched him work through that in his face, the frustration looking for a new direction. He found one. She'd set the meat cleaver on the edge of the counter while she was pulling his order, and now it had shifted and dropped. It hit the floor flat with a loud clang. She bent to pick it up. When she straightened, Donald's hand was already moving. It didn't connect. A hand came out from the other side of the counter, fast, no hesitation, and caught Donald's wrist mid-swing. Gideon Blackwood had moved without a sound, and now he held Donald's arm locked at a dead stop, his grip easy but absolute. Donald went red. "You let go of me, right?" "No." Gideon's voice was quiet. It didn't need volume. "I don't think I will." He held Donald's wrist for another 2 seconds, long enough for the point to land clearly. Then he released it and stepped back to his side of the counter. He looked at Donald with an expression that wasn't quite contempt, wasn't quite pity, something in between. "A man's hands were given to him to work and protect," he said, "not to vent his cowardice on a woman who can't fight back." The store was very quiet. Donald opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at Gideon's size, at the set of his shoulders, at the complete absence of anything uncertain in his face. Then he picked up his newspaper from the counter and walked to the back room without another word. Maeve finished writing the total in the ledger. Her hand was steady. She was proud of that. She slid the ledger across to Gideon and told him his total. He counted out exact change from a worn leather pouch and set it on the counter. He picked up his goods and started for the door. Then he paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. Just briefly, his eyes went to her face, the fading bruise on her jaw, her chapped hands, and then back to her eyes. He didn't say anything else. He walked out, untied his roan, and rode back down the street, through the snow. Maeve stood behind the counter for a moment. She wasn't used to being looked at like that, like a person who was worth looking at. She picked up the meat cleaver and hung it properly on its hook, right where it belonged. Then she opened the next account ledger and got back to work. 3 days passed. Garrow sent a written message on the second day, not a letter. Exactly. More of a notice. Maeve saw it on the kitchen table before Gertrude could fold it away. The language was formal and cold. Final terms of settlement, property transfer, personal indenture to be signed no later than Friday. A line at the bottom, written in Garrow's own hand, reminded Gertrude of certain consequences that would follow from non-compliance. Maeve read it in the time it took to set a coffee cup on the table. Then she walked back out to the store floor like she hadn't seen anything. She spent that evening making copies of the most critical ledger pages, using the backside of old inventory sheets. Small, careful handwriting. Every figure exact. She folded the copies and tucked them into the lining of her left boot, where the leather had separated from the inner sole and left a flat pocket just wide enough. On Friday morning, Gertrude's fear reached its full height. Maeve saw it in the way she moved fast, jerky, not looking at anything directly. She was terrified of Garrow, had been since the beginning, and terror had a way of making people cruel toward whoever was closest. "You'll do what he says," Gertrude told her at breakfast, not looking up from her coffee. "You'll sign what he puts in front of you, and be grateful it's not worse." Maeve said nothing. "Don't give me that look. This family's survival is worth more than your pride." "I'm not looking at you any particular way," Maeve said. "I'm just eating breakfast." Donald laughed from across the table, which was the most useless thing he did most mornings, and then Gertrude started in again about the debt, about Garrow's patience running out, about what happened to families who didn't honor their obligations. She used the word obligations, like it was a thing with weight. like it pressed down on everyone equally. Maeve finished her breakfast and washed her dish. When Garrow arrived that afternoon, he came with 3 men instead of 2. He set a document on the counter and laid a pen beside it, with the precision of a man who did not expect to be questioned. The indenture contract. She could read enough of it in a quick scan to understand what it was, what it made her. A piece of property with a signature on it. She kept her face still. Gertrude was already moving toward her, one hand reaching for her arm, and Maeve stepped back once. "Don't touch me," she said quietly. Gertrude stopped. Something in Maeve's voice had changed, not louder, just different, firmer at the edges. But she was alone in a room with 4 men and a stepmother who had already decided, and she knew the arithmetic of that situation as clearly as she knew any other. Garrow told her to sign. One of his men moved to the side door. The other stood near the back. There was no clean way out. Not today. She was still standing at the counter, not signing, not moving, when Gertrude and Donald put her in the woodshed. They didn't call it that. Gertrude said she needed time to think, said she was being dramatic, said this was for the family's good. Donald put his hand on her shoulder and pushed her toward the back door. And when she resisted, Garrow nodded at his men, and the choice was made for her. The woodshed was small and uninsulated. It sat 10 feet behind the store's back porch, used for overflow stock in summer and for nothing useful in winter. Right now it held 4 cords of split wood stacked along the walls and a cold that was close and immediate and had nowhere to go. The door latched from the outside. Maeve stood in the dark for a moment and let her eyes adjust. Then she sat down on a low stack of wood and thought carefully. She was not going to panic. Panic used up heat and clarity, both of which she needed. Her coat was on. She'd been wearing it when they pushed her out, and her boots were on, and the copies of the ledger pages were still in the lining of her left boot. She found a piece of broken barrel hoop on the ground near the door, a thin, curved strip of metal with one sharp edge. She carried it back to the wood stack and sat down again. She started scratching figures into the flat side of a split log, the real debt totals, the dates of payment, the settlement amounts, column by column. She did it slowly and precisely, not because she'd forget otherwise, but because the work itself steadied her. Numbers had always done that, given her something solid to stand on when everything else was moving. She worked through the figures twice. Then she sat back and looked at them in the thin light coming through the door's gap. Her father had been a careful man. He'd left her careful records, and those records, if she could get them to the right person, would pull the thread that unraveled everything Garrow had built. She just had to get out of this shed first. The cold came down over the next hour. She kept moving her fingers, flexing them, not letting them go fully numb. She'd learned the difference between the numb that was manageable and the numb that meant trouble. She was still on the right side of it, but the temperature was dropping. As the afternoon light faded, she heard footsteps on the back porch. She went still, listening. The latch lifted. The door swung open, and for a moment the gray outdoor light was brighter than anything she'd seen in an hour, and she blinked against it. Gideon Blackwood stood in the doorway. He took in the shed, the cold, her hands, and the figures scratched into the log beside her. He didn't say anything for a second. His jaw tightened once, briefly, and then he stepped inside. He was carrying a folded wool blanket. He held it out to her. She took it and pulled it around her shoulders and felt the warmth begin to move through the wool, slow and real. He also had a cloth-wrapped bundle. He set it on the wood stack beside her bread, and something wrapped in paper that turned out to be a thick slice of roasted beef, still warm from somewhere. "Eat," he said. She ate. She didn't argue. This was not the moment for pride. He leaned against the door frame and looked out at the back of the store, giving her space to eat without being watched. The light was going gold and gray outside, the late afternoon settling in. When she'd eaten most of it, she wrapped the rest back up and held it in her hands. "How did you know I was in here?" she asked. "I came by for a salt order. The store was closed early." He paused. "You're not the kind of person who closes the store early." She absorbed that. "Gertrude locked it," she said. "Garrow was here, I know." He turned back to look at her. His expression was even and serious. "There's a contract. I heard about it before I got here." She nodded. "I didn't sign it." "Good." He looked at her directly. "No debt on earth gives anyone the right to strip a human being of their dignity and freedom. What's being done to you has no legal or moral ground beneath it." "None." He said it plainly, without heat, like a fact he'd already fully made up his mind about. She looked down at the wool blanket. She had been told a version of the world where what was happening to her was ordinary, where family obligations meant you gave up what you were owed, where a woman's options were to comply or disappear. She'd never quite believed it. But having someone say the opposite out loud, without softening it, was something different. "They'll try again tomorrow," she said. "Yes," he said. "They will." He didn't offer her empty comfort. She appreciated that more than she could say. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded slowly, thinking something through. "I'm going to talk to the circuit judge's office in the morning. You have evidence?" "I have the ledger and copies." She pressed her foot slightly, feeling the paper in her boot. "My father paid every debt he owed. Garrow built the rest from nothing." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Something settled in his expression, not surprise, but confirmation, like he'd suspected this much, and now knew it for certain. "Hold on to those," he said. "Don't let them search you." She almost smiled. "I've been hiding things from that family for 3 years, Mr. Blackwood. I know how." He studied her face. Then, for the first time, the corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but close. "Stay warm tonight," he said. He pulled the shed door most of the way closed from the outside, leaving the latch up, so she could push it open herself if she needed to. A small thing, a deliberate one. She heard his boots cross the porch and fade. She pulled the blanket tighter and looked at the numbers scratched into the log. Tomorrow was coming. So was Garrow. But so, apparently, was Gideon Blackwood. She tucked that away, alongside everything else she'd been quietly gathering. Not as hope, exactly. As information. As one more piece of a picture that was starting to come clear. She settled in and waited for morning. The morning came in fast and cold. Maeve had slept in short stretches. The wool blanket pulled up to her chin, her back against the stacked wood. Each time she woke, she checked her boot. The paper was still there. She listened to the store, the creak of the building in the wind, the distant sound of horses on the street. She kept her mind on the ledger figures, on the dates, on the facts she knew to be true. Facts were the only thing nobody could take from you without your permission. Gertrude opened the shed door at 7. She didn't say good morning. She told Maeve to come inside, wash up, and be ready. Garrow was coming at 9. She said it like a woman reciting something she'd already made peace with, and maybe she had. Maybe that was the worst part, not that Gertrude was cruel, but that she had stopped asking whether any of this was right. Maeve washed her face at the basin. She changed her collar. She checked her boot one more time. She was behind the counter at 8:30, writing in the daily ledger with her head down when she heard Garrow's horse in the street. Then 2 more horses behind it. Then a third. She counted the sounds without looking up. He came in with 4 men this time. 2 of them stayed by the door. One went to the far wall and leaned against it with his arms crossed. The 4th stayed half a step behind Garrow, who walked to the counter and set his hat on top of it, like he owned the place, because he believed he did. The contract came out of his coat pocket, already unfolded. He laid it flat on the counter and smoothed it with his palm. Donald was on the stairs. Gertrude stood near the stove, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Garrow looked at Maeve. Today, he said. She looked at the contract. She looked at the pen he set beside it. She didn't pick it up. He leaned forward on the counter, close enough that she could smell the bay rum on his coat. "Your stepmother has been very reasonable. Be reasonable, too. Sign it, and this is settled without any further unpleasantness." "My father paid every cent he owed to this bank," Maeve said. Her voice was level. "I have the receipts." Something moved through Garrow's expression fast, controlled, gone in less than a second. "Your father's records are incomplete and contested. The terms in front of you are legal and binding. They're fraud," she said. The room got very quiet. Garrow stood back up to his full height. He nodded at the man behind him, who moved toward Maeve's side of the counter. The front door opened. Gideon Blackwood walked in. He didn't rush. He came through the door at the same steady pace. He did everything, and he stopped just inside the threshold and let the room settle around his presence. He was wearing his sheepskin coat and his hat, and he had his shotgun carried loose in his right hand, barreled toward the floor. He looked at the two men by the door, at the one by the wall, at Garrow's man who had stopped moving toward Maeve. He looked at all of it in about 3 seconds, and then he looked at Garrow. Garrow's hired guns exchanged a glance. Gideon had a reputation in this valley that wasn't built on talk. He'd come back from the border wars without any particular need to prove himself, and men who didn't need to prove themselves were the most dangerous kind to push. Blackwood, Garrow said. This is a private business matter, I can see that. Gideon came to the counter and stood beside Maeve. He looked at the contract. What's the total figure you're claiming? Garrow studied him. Why? Because I'm going to pay it. A beat of silence. Garrow's mouth curved slightly. You don't know what the figure is. Then tell me. Garrow named a number. It was high. Calculated to sting. Built to feel like a wall. He said it with the confidence of a man who had used that particular wall successfully before. Gideon reached into his coat and set a leather pouch on the counter. It landed with the specific weight of a thing that settles arguments. That covers her father's original debt, he said. The real one. The one recorded in the bank's own ledger before your name appeared in it. He kept his eyes on Garrow. I had a conversation with the bank manager in Millhaven yesterday evening. He remembers the account. He remembers the payoff. And he's writing that down for the circuit judge's office as of this morning. Garrow's expression didn't change, but his hands, flat on the counter, pressed down slightly. You can't buy a person, Garrow said. No, Gideon agreed. You can't. He picked up the Bowie knife from his belt and drove it down through the contract into the wooden counter, pinning it clean through. Then he reached down and cut the iron chain Garrow's man had fastened around Maeve's ankle. Earlier that morning, the one she'd said nothing about because saying something would have meant crying. And she hadn't cried in front of these people in 3 years. The chain fell to the floor. Gideon straightened and turned to Maeve. He put his hand out, and she took it, and he stepped back so that she stood beside him. Behind him, on the same side of the counter as the door, he leveled the shotgun at Garrow. His voice dropped, quieter than before, which somehow made it carry further. She's not a piece of livestock for you to bargain over. Starting right now, she's coming home with me. He moved his eyes across Garrow's men, one to the next. Anyone who wants to stop her can answer to my shotgun first. Nobody moved. Garrow looked at the Bowie knife standing up through his contract. He looked at his men. He looked at Gideon's face for a long moment, reading whatever was there, and whatever he found told him what he needed to know. This isn't finished, Garrow said. No, Gideon said. It's just starting. He walked Maeve toward the door. She passed within 6 feet of Gertrude, who stood by the stove, with her hands still clasped, and her face turned slightly away, like she couldn't quite look at what she'd done, and couldn't quite look away from it either. Maeve paused. She looked at her stepmother for a full second. Not with anger, not with forgiveness, just with the clear-eyed recognition of someone who has finally seen a thing completely and knows they won't be confused about it again. Then she walked out the door. The cold hit her in the face, and it felt clean. The street was quiet, the snow bright under the morning sun. Gideon's roan was tied at the post, and beside it a second horse, a steady bay mare with a bedroll tied behind the saddle. He'd come prepared. She put her foot in the stirrup and mounted the bay without needing help. He swung up onto the roan, and they rode out of Rock Ridge side by side, at a pace that was unhurried and deliberate, because running suggested fear, and neither of them was afraid. She didn't look back, or rather, she made herself not look back, which was different. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, on the open valley, on the mountains, still white, with winter above the timberline. She pressed her left foot against the inside of her boot and felt the folded paper there. She had what she needed. For the first time in 3 years, she was moving towards something instead of just ring. Blackwood Ranch sat 3 miles west of town, tucked into a long, shallow valley where 2 creek arms came together. and a line of cottonwoods followed the bank all the way down to the south pasture. From the road, the first thing you saw was the barn, big, dark red, solid as a promise, and then the house behind it, 2 stories of rough-cut timber with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front. It was plain. It was well built. It looked like a place that intended to be standing in 100 years. Maeve took it in as they rode up the lane, and she said nothing. Gideon put the horses up himself. She offered to help, and he handed her the lighter task, the hay, without any comment about whether she was capable of it or whether she ought to be doing it at all. She appreciated that. She was tired of people deciding what she could handle. Inside, the house was warmer than she expected. A fire had been banked in the main room's stone fireplace, and the kitchen had a large iron stove that radiated steady heat. The floors were plain wood, scrubbed clean. The furniture was spare: a long table, a bench, 2 chairs, a bookshelf along the east wall with a reasonable number of books on it. She noticed the books. Gideon showed her the room at the top of the stairs. It had a window that faced south, a rope bed with a quilted mattress, a chest of drawers, and a hook on the back of the door for coats. A braided rug covered the center of the floor. On the windowsill, someone had left a small tin pitcher with dried flowers in it, long dried, from last summer, but still there. "This is yours," he said, "for as long as you need it." She looked around the room. It was the first space in 3 years that was genuinely hers, not a corner of the storeroom, not a pallet in the kitchen, not a shed. A room with a door she could close. "I'll pay for my keep," she said immediately. "I can cook, clean, maintain records, Maeve." He said her name once, not unkindly. She stopped. "You're not here to pay for anything," he said. "You're a guest in this house. A guest doesn't scrub floors to earn their right to exist here." She looked at him. Old habits pushed back the automatic accounting of what she owed, what was expected, what would happen if she didn't make herself useful enough. "I'm not good at doing nothing," she said honestly. "I'm not asking you to do nothing. I'm asking you to stop keeping score." He leaned against the doorframe. "When you're ready to do something because you want to, not because you're afraid of what happens if you don't, then we'll talk about what you contribute." She sat down on the edge of the bed. He left her to settle in. She sat there for a while in the quiet room with the south-facing window, listening to the sounds of the ranch, a horse moving in the barn, the creak of the cottonwoods by the creek, wind across the roof. Ordinary sounds. Nothing in them was aimed at her. She wasn't used to that either. The first few days were strange. She woke at 4 o'clock by habit and lay in bed in the dark, waiting for a voice to call her down. No voice came. She got up anyway because sleep wouldn't return, and she went to the kitchen and built up the fire and made coffee. And when Gideon came down at 5:30, he found her sitting at the table with a cup and a book from his shelf. He poured himself coffee and sat across from her and didn't say anything about the fact that she'd lit the stove. She watched him over the top of the book. He was reading his own thing, a survey map spread out on the table's far end, waited at the corners with his coffee cup and a salt block. He moved a finger along a line she couldn't read from her angle, made a note in pencil on a scrap of paper, and went back to looking, absorbed, unbothered by her presence. It occurred to her that this was what comfortable felt like. 2 people in the same room, without any tension in it. She turned back to her book. By the end of the first week, she had identified a problem. She'd asked to look at the ranch ledgers just to familiarize herself with the operation, she told him. He'd pulled them out and set them on the table without any hesitation. She spent an afternoon going through the accounts, and by supper she had found what she was looking for. The livestock broker, Gideon, used for his cattle sales, had been marking up fees on the resale commissions. Not enormously, just enough that it wouldn't jump out at first glance, but it was consistent across every transaction for the past 2 years, and when she added up the cumulative overcharge, the number was significant. She brought it to him that evening. She set the ledger on the table and showed him the column, walking him through each entry, pointing out the markup pattern, showing the arithmetic plainly. He followed her through it without interrupting. When she finished, he sat back. "How long?" he asked. 2 years at least. I'd need his original receipts to go back further. He looked at the figures for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I've been going over these books myself for 2 years," he said. "I know." He buried it well. "You have to look at the percentage, not the total. The total moves with the herd size, so it doesn't look wrong on its own." Gideon nodded slowly. He wasn't embarrassed, which she respected. Some men would have been. He'd absorbed the information and moved to the next practical question. "Can you document it in a way the broker can't dispute?" "Yes." "Give me 2 days." He gave her 2 days. She worked at the kitchen table, building the comparative analysis from scratch, using the ledger entries and the published commodity rates from the Territorial Livestock Board to construct the discrepancy report. She knew how to build evidence. She'd been doing it for months on her own situation, and the same principles applied here. On the third morning, she put the finished document in front of him at breakfast. He read it. He read it again. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket. "I'll ride to town this afternoon," he said. "The broker will argue." "He can try." He looked at her across the table. "This is good work, Maeve." She almost deflected it, almost said, "It was nothing, just arithmetic. Anyone could have done it." She caught herself. "Thank you," she said, instead. He nodded once. That was all. He didn't make a production of it. She poured them both more coffee. That evening, when she was washing the supper dishes, he came to stand in the kitchen doorway. Not close. Just there. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want you to actually hear it." She turned around. He was looking at her steadily. The way he looked at things he was serious about. "There are no masters or servants on this land. Your self-worth isn't measured by what you think you owe. It's measured by how you treat yourself." He paused. "You contribute your mind. I share my home. We stand here as equals." She held the dish in her hands and looked at him. She had heard a great many things said to her over the past 3 years. Instructions, criticisms, demands. Occasionally, something dressed up as kindness that turned out to be one more leash. She'd gotten good at knowing the difference. This was different. She believed him, not because he'd been generous, and not because she had nowhere else to go, because in 10 days she hadn't once caught him saying one thing and meaning another. What Gideon Blackwood said he meant. That was rarer than it should have been. "All right," she said. He nodded. He went back to the main room and his survey maps. She put the dish away and looked out the kitchen window at the dark ranch yard, the barn roof against the stars, the creek catching moonlight through the cottonwoods. Her hands were starting to heal. The cracks from the cold were closing. Slowly, the way skin did when you stopped punishing it. She flexed her fingers once, watching them in the lamplight. She thought about the ledger copies in her boot, which she'd moved to a flat tin box under the floorboard of her room. She thought about Garrow and what he had done to her father. She thought about the circuit judge and how long it might take to get word to his office. She thought about how it felt to sit at a table and be asked what she knew and have the answer taken seriously. She turned back to the dishes. There was still a long road ahead. Garrow wasn't finished, and she knew it. But for the first time in a very long time, Maeve Thorne was sleeping in a real room, eating at a real table, and standing on ground that nobody was trying to take out from under her. She intended to make very good use of that. 2 weeks into February, a blizzard came down off the northern range and buried the valley under 3 feet of new snow. Maeve didn't mind it. She'd always found something clarifying about bad weather. It narrowed the world down to what was right in front of you, cut out the noise, gave you one thing to focus on at a time. And right now, the thing in front of her was the ranch's full financial record, spread across the kitchen table in organized piles, while the wind pushed hard against the windows. Gideon had given her access to everything: receipts, invoices, correspondence with buyers, past cattle tallies going back 5 years. She'd started with the broker discrepancy, documented it thoroughly, and then kept going because she was built that way. Once she started pulling a thread, she needed to know how far it went. She was cross-referencing purchase orders from the regional livestock exchange when she found the first number that didn't fit. It wasn't in Gideon's records. It was in a set of old documents she'd asked him to pull from the storage chest in the barn papers that had come with the property when he bought it 3 years prior. Records left by the previous owner. She almost set them aside. She was glad she didn't. The previous owner had done business with Garrow's operation. Routine transactions, cattle purchases. Nothing unusual on the surface, but there was a payment record from late 1878 that referenced a debt settlement with a third party, and the third party's name was Thorne, her father's name. She sat very still. She pulled that page out and set it alone on the corner of the table. Then she went to her room and got the tin box from under the floorboard and brought her own ledger copies back to the kitchen. She laid them side by side and started comparing. It took her an hour. The numbers intersected at a single point, a payment her father had made to the livestock exchange in the spring of 1878, which Garrow had subsequently altered in the exchange's duplicate records to appear as an unpaid liability. He'd used his position as a partial stakeholder in the exchange to access those records. The original unaltered version, the one her father had kept, showed the payment clearly with the exchange agent's initials beside it. Garrow hadn't just manufactured a debt. He'd manipulated official records to do it, and her father had discovered it. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. Her father had been a meticulous man. If he'd found what she'd just found, he would have written it down. He would have saved the evidence and started asking questions. And someone who was willing to alter official records to steal a man's property would not have wanted those questions asked. A wet road, a steep hill, a wheel that gave way. She'd had the suspicion for years. Now she had the mechanism. Garrow had needed her father gone before he could take the records to anyone credible. And Gertrude, panicking and financially illiterate and easy to manipulate, had been exactly the opening Garrow needed once the funeral was over. Her father's wagon accident had not been an accident. She got up and put a log on the fire and stood there for a moment with her hand on the mantel, looking into the flames. She gave herself 60 seconds to feel the full weight of it. Then she went back to the table and started building the documentary case. Methodically, column by column. She was so absorbed in the work that she almost didn't hear the horses. She heard them, at the last moment, multiple sets of hooves, moving fast, despite the snow, coming up the ranch road. She went to the window and looked out through the frost. 4 riders. She could see the glint of a badge on the lead rider's coat, the marshal. She moved fast. She gathered the most critical documents, the original ledger copies, the livestock exchange records, the comparative analysis, and rolled them tight, wrapping them in the oilcloth she kept in the kitchen drawer. She took the roll to her room, pushed it under the loose floorboard, and replaced the rug over it. She was back in the kitchen with a dish towel in her hands when the knock came. Gideon was already coming in from the barn. She could hear his boots on the porch. He opened the door before she reached it. Marshal Cord Deaver was a broad man with a gray beard and small eyes that moved too quickly to belong to someone with a clean conscience. He had 3 deputies behind him, all armed, and they were spread out in a way that was meant to look casual and didn't. Blackwood, Deaver said, got a complaint filed. Young woman on your property is claimed as indentured property of Phineas Garrow by legal contract. There's no legal contract, Gideon said. The original was voided, and I have documentation to that effect. Garrow's got a copy filed with my office. A copy of a document I put a knife through. Deaver smiled without warmth. Law doesn't care about the knife, son. Care about the filing. He looked past Gideon's shoulder at Maeve. She needs to come with us. Gideon didn't move from the doorway. You'll need to show me the filing, he said, in writing. I'm not releasing anyone from this property on a verbal claim. Deaver reached into his coat and pulled out a paper. Gideon took it and read it slowly, making Deaver wait. Maeve watched Gideon's face. She'd learned to read the small shifts in his expression, the tightening at the corner of his mouth that meant he was controlling something. He was controlling something now. The paper was in order. That was the problem. Garrow had gotten to Deaver early enough to make the filing look legitimate, and a legitimate filing gave Deaver legal cover for exactly this. She could see Gideon running the same calculation she was. Give me an hour to consult with. No, sir, Deaver said. He stepped forward, and his deputies moved with him, and the doorway wasn't wide enough for Gideon to hold all of them at once. What happened next was fast and loud. One of the deputies grabbed Maeve's arm from behind. She hadn't heard him come around the side of the house, and she pulled hard against his grip. She heard Gideon shout her name. She heard the scuffle at the doorway, a crash of something falling, and then a shot cracked through the air from somewhere outside. Not at her. She didn't know where it went. The barn caught first. She didn't see how. Later, she would think. It must have been a lantern, knocked over in the struggle, or one of the deputies, a stray shot hitting something dry. But in the moment, all she knew was that the south wall of the barn was lit orange and the fire was moving fast through the hay. She was already outside, one of Deaver's men, with a grip on her arm, when she heard a second shot. She spun around. Gideon was on the porch steps. He'd gotten past two of the deputies and he was moving toward her, and then he wasn't. He went down hard, one hand catching the porch rail and missing it, and he hit the snow-covered ground on his side and didn't get back up. She stopped pulling. She stood absolutely still in the grip of the deputy's hand, in the snow, with the barn burning behind her, and the cold air full of smoke, and the sound of men shouting. She looked at Gideon lying in the snow. She looked at the spread of dark against his coat on the left side. The world went very quiet around the edges. She heard one of the deputies say something about moving out before the fire spread. She felt herself being pulled toward a horse. She didn't resist because resistance required the part of her brain she'd temporarily lost access to. They put her on a horse in front of a deputy and started moving. She looked back. The barn was burning in full now, a column of fire and smoke going up into the gray blizzard sky, lit from within like something terrible and bright. And in the snow, at the foot of the porch steps, Gideon hadn't moved. She'd held herself together through 3 years of cruelty, without crying once in front of anyone who meant her harm. She'd held herself together through the woodshed, through the contract, through Garrow's men and Deaver's deputies. She did not hold herself together now. It wasn't the fire. It wasn't even the fear, exactly. It was the understanding that arrived suddenly and completely, the way understanding sometimes did that she loved him, and the realization had come at the precise moment she might have lost him. And there was nothing she could do about any of it from the back of this horse in the middle of a blizzard. She faced forward. She memorized the road. She stopped crying and started thinking, because Gideon Blackwood had not spent the last 2 weeks teaching her to trust her own mind only for her to fall apart at the exact moment that mind was most needed. She was going to need every bit of it. The bullet had hit him flat on the left side, just below the collarbone. That was what Dr. Rubin said when he found Gideon in the snow. 40 minutes after the riders left, found him because the burning barn lit up the night sky and half the valley could see it. And Reuben had harnessed his horse and driven his cart out through the blizzard, because that was what Reuben did. He drove toward the fire. The military dog tag Gideon had worn since the border wars hung on a chain against his chest. The bullet had struck it, flattened, and deflected downward, punching through the muscle below the collar bone instead of going into the lung. Deep, painful, serious enough, but not the shot it should have been. Reuben dug it out by lamplight in Gideon's kitchen, cursing steadily in low tones the entire time, which was how he operated under pressure. The cursing was almost soothing if you knew him well enough. Gideon was conscious for most of it. That was its own particular misery. Stay still, Reuben said for the 4th time. You need to stay still, or I'll put you out myself with the laudanum bottle, and you won't like how you feel when you wake up. Reuben pressed a cloth firmly to the wound. She's gone, Gideon. She's not at the end of this road right now. You are. Gideon turned his head and looked at the ceiling. Deaver filed a false instrument, he said. Yes, Garrow got to him, probably a while ago. That's a problem for when you're ambulatory. Reuben tied the bandage with the efficiency of someone who had done this on worse wounds under worse circumstances. Right now, your only job is to not bleed anymore. Gideon looked at the ceiling for another 10 seconds. Then he said, "How long until I can ride?" Reuben paused. He looked at his patient with the expression of a man who already knew the answer he was going to get and was deciding whether to fight it. "A week," he said. "Minimum." "Tomorrow," Gideon said. Reuben sat back and rubbed his face. "You're the most unreasonable patient I've had since Amos Petrie tried to shear sheep with a broken wrist. How did that go for Amos?" "Badly. He tore it open again and I had to reset it." Reuben began packing his kit. "But I noticed he got the sheep shorn, so maybe I'm wasting my time arguing with you." He looked up. "If you ride tomorrow, you will do it slowly. You will not do anything that requires your left arm. If you start bleeding through the bandage, you stop and you send for me. Are we clear?" "Clear." "I mean it, Gideon. I know you do." Reuben left at midnight, taking the road back to town, carefully through the settled snow. Gideon lay in his bed and looked at the window and thought. He thought about Maeve at the kitchen table, with her ledger pages spread out around her, building her case with the same focused patience she applied to everything. He thought about the look on her face, that first night in the woodshed composed on the surface, doing arithmetic on a log to keep her mind working, because she'd figured out early in life that a working mind was the only advantage she reliably had access to. He thought about what Garrow would do with her now, and that thought was what got him out of bed at 6 in the morning, despite the bandage and the cold and the 3 inches of new snow on the ground. He saddled the roan left-handed. It took twice as long as usual. He did it. Garrow's operation ran out of a property, 12 miles east, a working ranch in name, more of a headquarters in practice, with a main house, a bunkhouse for the hired guns, and a large storage facility built into the hillside that Garrow used for everything from legitimate grain storage to considerably less legitimate purposes. Maeve knew the layout from town gossip. She'd been listening to gossip in that store for 3 years, with her face blank and her ears sharp, and people talked more freely when they thought nobody was paying attention. She paid attention to everything. They'd put her in a room in the main house, a storeroom, converted, with a cot and a locked door. Not the worst room she'd ever slept in, given the woodshed. There was a lantern on a high shelf, bolted down so she couldn't tip it. There were 4 kerosene lamps on a long shelf along the far wall, their valves intact, full of fuel. She looked at those valves for a long time. Then she looked at the cot frame. Iron, but below it, the rope support was braided hemp, knotted at the frame. She worked one of the knots loose with her fingernails, slow and patient, and got herself a length of rope about 4 feet long, with a thick knot at one end that went under the thin mattress. Then she started on the lamp valves. The room was meant to be a storeroom, and storerooms had things in them in this case. A shelf of tools along the left wall, improperly inventoried, because Garrow's men were better at intimidation than organization. She found a flat-head screwdriver on the second shelf. She used it to crack the valve stems on 3 of the 4 lamps. Just enough. Not so they flowed immediately. Just enough that if someone struck a match within the next few hours, the kerosene vapor would have somewhere interesting to go. She put the screwdriver back exactly where she found it. Then she sat on the cot and waited, because patience had always been her longest weapon, and she saw no reason to put it down now. Garrow came to her in the mid-afternoon. He sat across from her on a crate, with his hat on his knee and his expression careful, which meant he wanted something and hadn't decided how to get it. She recognized the calculation. She'd watched him run it before. He told her the situation plainly. She would sign a revised indenture. She would turn over whatever documents she'd compiled. And the matter of Gideon Blackwood would be handled quietly, meaning he'd be pressured and bought out and eventually gone. She looked at him and said nothing. "You're a smart woman," he said. "Smarter than your stepmother gave you credit for. And I don't say that lightly. That's why I'm talking to you directly instead of just deciding for you." He leaned forward slightly. "You could do well in this arrangement. Better than that store." "My father built that store," she said. "Your father is dead. I know that. She met his eyes. I know exactly how he died. A silence. Garrow's expression didn't shift much. Just a small adjustment, almost invisible. But she saw it, because she'd been watching people's faces her entire life. He knew that she knew. He stood up, put his hat back on, and left. The lock clicked behind him. She listened to his footsteps until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she got the piece of glass. She'd found it that morning under the cot's leg, a shard from something broken before she arrived. Missed during whatever cursory cleaning had been done on the room. It was about 3 inches long, curved on one side, sharp enough. She'd kept it in her boot. She worked on the rope, binding her wrists. They'd tied her before leaving her in the room. Standard procedure. She had to bend at an uncomfortable angle to get the glass to the rope, working it back and forth in short strokes, careful about her wrists. It took almost 20 minutes. The rope fell off. She stood up and stretched her arms, flexed her hands, let the circulation come back. Then she looked at the 4 lamp valves and the door and the high small window above the supply shelf. She could reach the window if she stood on the shelf. She tested its weight against the wall bolted. Good. She climbed up, staying low, and worked the window latch. It was stiff with cold and opened reluctantly. But it opened. She looked out. The yard below was covered in snow, white and open. 2 of Garrow's men were visible near the bunkhouse, maybe 40 yards away, not looking at the main house. The sky was late afternoon gray, the light starting to go. She needed a distraction. She climbed back down and stood in front of the lamps. She unscrewed the valve stems the rest of the way, careful, controlled, turning her face aside from the fumes. She didn't light anything. The vapor would need time to build in the room. When someone came in with a lantern or struck a match, the room would decide its own next move. She went back up to the window and squeezed through it. She dropped into the snow below with a sound that was less than she expected. She pressed against the wall for 10 seconds, watching the yard. Nobody looked her way. She started moving. She went behind the main house. Then along the tree line at the property's western edge, keeping low, moving fast through the snow. Her boots were not made for this. She was soaked to the ankle within 3 minutes, but cold feet were a problem she could solve later. Getting out was the problem she was solving now. She was 200 yards from the main house when she heard the sound she'd been waiting for, a man's voice, then a startled shout, and then the soft, concussive sound of a room's worth of kerosene vapor finding an ignition source. She didn't stop moving. She was moving through the trees at the property's north edge when she heard the horse. She spun around, ready to run, and then she didn't run because the rider was coming from the west, and he was alone. And the horse was a big roan, and the man in the saddle was riding left-handed and looked like someone who had very recently been told to stay in bed. She stood in the snow in the trees and watched him come. He saw her at about 30 yards. He slowed the roan to a walk and came the last distance carefully, looking at her, her bare wrists, her wet boots, the direction she'd come from. Behind them both, the glow of a fire was visible above the roof of the main house. "You're out," he said. "I'm out," she agreed. He looked at the fire glow. He looked back at her. Something moved through his expression, relief so complete and unguarded. It changed his whole face for a moment, before he got it back under control. "Can you get up?" he said, nodding to the space behind his saddle. She could, and she did, swinging up behind him, getting her arms around his midsection. She felt him tighten on the left side and knew immediately it was the wound. "I've got you," she said. "I won't put weight on that side." He turned the roan north, toward the road, toward Rock Ridge. "The documents," he said, "under the floorboard in my room, still there." "Good." He kept the horse at a careful pace through the snow. "Reuben's in town. We'll get you warm, and then we need to talk to the judge's office before Garrow regroups. He knows I have the evidence on my father's accident," she said. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Your father?" "It wasn't an accident. I can prove it. Garrow altered records at the livestock exchange. I have the original." She paused. "My father found it first. That's why he died." Another silence. The snow came down around them, gentle, now the blizzard worn out. "Then we move tonight," Gideon said. His voice was steady and clear. No hesitation in it. "This ends now." She nodded against his shoulder. her arms around him, the roan moving sure-footed through the dark. She had her evidence, she had her wits, and she had someone riding wounded through a blizzard who had decided somewhere along the way that her life was worth more than his own comfort. She held on and kept her eyes on the road ahead. They rode into Rock Ridge at 9:30. The main street was quiet at that hour, most of the respectable businesses dark, the saloon at the far end still lit and loud piano music and voices, the smell of wood smoke and whiskey pushing out through the gaps in the door. Gideon pulled the roan up at Dr. Rubin's house first. Light was on in the front window. Reuben opened the door before they knocked. He looked at Gideon. He looked at the bandage, which had bled through on the left side, a dark bloom against the wool of his coat. He looked at Maeve, soaking wet from the knees down, her wrists marked from the rope. "Inside," he said, in a voice that had no interest in argument. Maeve sat by Reuben's fire and let him check her wrists while Gideon stood in the kitchen doorway, and they talked through what she knew. She gave it to them in order: the livestock exchange records, the altered entries, the payment her father had made, the timeline that put Garrow's motive in clear sight. Reuben listened with his hands working on her wrists and his face growing more still with each piece of information. When she finished, he sat back and looked at Gideon. "The circuit judge is in town," Reuben said. Both of them looked at him. "Arrived this afternoon. He's staying at the hotel. I had supper with him." Reuben stood up and went to the sideboard for his coat. "His name is Aldrich. He's as straight as timber, and he has no connection to Garrow's money. I'd know if he did." He pulled the coat on. "I'll go get him." "Now," Gideon said. "You have a better time in mind?" Gideon looked at Maeve. She shook her head. "Now," she said. Reuben went out. They could hear his boots fast on the frozen street. Maeve dried her feet by the fire and pulled on a pair of wool socks Reuben had left for her from some drawer. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Gideon sat across from her, his left arm held carefully, watching the fire. "You did well tonight," he said. "I had good information and time to think." She looked at her hands. The rope marks were already fading to pink. "Intelligence is only useful if you trust it enough to act on it." He nodded slowly. "You trusted it. I've been trusting it my whole life. It's the only thing that's never let me down." They sat quietly for a moment, the fire between them. Then she heard the horses. Not Reuben. More than one, coming fast, and when she went to the window, she could see torchlight moving up the street from the east end of town. Garrow's men. 6 of them, maybe more, and Garrow himself at the front, hatless, his face lit orange and furious. The fire at his property had done its work, and he had ridden hard. "Reuben's not back yet," she said. Gideon was already on his feet, taking his shotgun from where he'd leaned it against the wall. He checked the load. He looked at her. "Stay here." "No." He looked at her for half a second. He knew better than to argue. "Stay behind me until I say otherwise." "Agreed." They went out. Garrow had already dismounted. His men were spread across the street in front of the saloon, which had gone quiet inside someone. In there had seen the riders, and the word had moved fast through the room. A few faces appeared at the windows. The piano had stopped. Garrow saw Gideon and Maeve come out of Reuben's house, and his face went through something complicated and landed on fury. "Blackwood," he said, "you're done. I'll see you in a federal prison before." "On what charge?" Gideon said. He kept walking, steady, covering the distance between them. "Freeing a woman from an illegal indenture, documenting your fraud, riding to get her out of a property you had no legal right to hold her in. She set fire to my storeroom, a storeroom you locked her in." Gideon stopped 20 feet from Garrow. "Where's Deaver behind you?" said a voice. Maeve turned. Deaver was coming from the alley between the saloon and the feed store, 2 deputies with him, and his hand was on his holster. He hadn't drawn yet. He was still deciding which way this was going to go. Then the saloon doors opened. Not all at once. One at a time, in ones and twos, the men inside came out onto the porch. Ranch hands, storekeepers, 2 men she recognized from the mill. They didn't say anything. They just came out and stood there, watching. Garrow's men looked at them. The numbers had shifted. Inside the saloon, something else was happening. She heard it: a shout, a crash, the sound of a table going over. Donald had been in there, she realized. She'd seen his horse at the rail and hadn't registered it until now. She moved toward the door. The saloon was thick with smoke and the particular chaos of a room that had been tense for an hour and just found its release. Two of Garrow's men who'd come in through the back were in the middle of the room, one of them already down, the other backing toward the bar, while a mill worker advanced on him with a chair. Donald was at the far end of the bar. He had a revolver in his hand, pointed not at her, but tracking across the room toward Gideon, who had just come through the front door after her. She didn't think about it. She picked up the heavy butcher's blade from the bar. Someone had been using it to cut salt pork earlier. It was just sitting there, and she crossed the room in 4 steps and brought the flat of it down hard on Donald's wrist. He dropped the revolver. It hit the floor and didn't fire, which was the best thing that happened all night. Donald spun around to face her, cradling his wrist, his face red and furious, and for once, genuinely surprised. He hadn't expected her to come at him. Nobody in that family ever had. "That's done," she said. He looked at her. The surprise drained out of his face and left something else, something closer to the truth of him, which was that he had always been afraid of people who weren't afraid of him. He stepped back. Gideon had crossed the room and disarmed Garrow's second man without much difficulty. Now Garrow himself was in the doorway, pushed from behind by 2 of the townsmen from the porch, and his expression had finally done what Maeve had been waiting 3 years to see it do. It had run out of certainty. Gideon took Garrow's weapon and put him on the floor with one hand on the back of his neck, holding him there the way you'd hold something down that had been dangerous, and now wasn't. Easy. Final. Maeve stood in the middle of the saloon, with the butcher's blade in her hand, and looked at Garrow, face down on the floorboards, and then at Gertrude, who had come in through the side door at some point and was standing against the wall, with her hands pressed flat to the wood behind her. And Maeve said it. She said what she'd been building toward for 3 years, through every cold morning, and every bruise, and every night, by a lamp with a ledger. You thought you could use money, violence, and fear to turn a human being into a servant. She looked at Garrow, then at Gertrude, at both of them. But intelligence, truth, and human dignity are things you can never buy. The room was quiet. Judge Aldrich walked in 30 seconds later with Reuben at his shoulder and took one long look at the scene. He was a lean man of 60 with white hair and a face that had seen enough to be difficult to shock. He looked at Gideon, at Garrow on the floor, at Maeve with the blade, at the assembled townsmen. "Somebody," he said, "is going to explain this to me, clearly and in order." Maeve set the blade on the bar and straightened her blanket. "That would be me," she said, "and I have the documents to back all of it up." The hearing took 2 days. Judge Aldrich commandeered the back room of the hotel, the largest private space in Rock Ridge, and ran it like a proper proceeding because he was a proper judge and he didn't know any other way to operate. He had a clerk with him who wrote everything down in a small, precise hand, and he questioned every witness himself, directly, without letting anyone ramble. Maeve retrieved her documents from Blackwood Ranch on the morning of the first day. The floorboard was exactly as she'd left it. She brought the tin box to the hearing room and laid everything out on the table, in the order she'd assembled it: the original ledger pages, the livestock exchange records, the comparative analysis she'd built, showing the altered entries, the bank settlement receipt with her father's signature, and the branch manager's stamp. She had also, at some point during those nights at the kitchen table, written a clean summary document, 4 pages, organized by date, walking through the full chain of events from her father's discovery of Garrow's manipulation, to the wagon accident, to the fraudulent debt, to the indenture attempt. She'd done it almost on instinct, the same way she did the accounts: make it clear, make it complete, make it impossible to misread. That summary document was what stopped Aldrich's questioning the first time he read it. He sat back and read it again, and then looked at her over the top of it. "You compiled this yourself?" he said. "Yes, sir." "Over what period of time?" "About 8 months for the original ledger work. The exchange records I found more recently." He set it down on the table in front of him. "Continue." "She testified for 3 hours on the first day. She walked him through every figure, answered every question, directly, corrected herself once when she'd written a date wrong in the summary, and caught it herself before he did. She didn't perform distress, and she didn't minimize what had happened to her. She stated it plainly: the labor, the confinement, the indenture contract, the chain, because plain statement was more credible than anything performed, and she understood that the most important thing she could give this proceeding was clarity. Gideon was in the room. He sat to the left, near the door, and he didn't speak unless Aldrich directed a question at him. When he did speak, he was concise. He confirmed what he'd witnessed, provided the date he'd retrieved her from the woodshed, described the confrontation in the general store in factual terms. He didn't editorialize. He didn't try to be the center of the story. He let her testimony stand on its own because it was her testimony, and it was strong, and he knew it. That was its own kind of respect, and she felt it. On the second day, the bank manager from Millhaven appeared. Gideon had sent a rider for him on the first morning and confirmed the payoff of her father's original loan. He had the bank's own copy of the settlement receipt, which matched hers exactly. He also confirmed that Garrow held a partial stakeholder position in the regional livestock exchange, which gave him access to duplicate records. The exchange's own agent testified by written affidavit delivered by the same rider. The affidavit confirmed that the records had been altered and identified the time frame. Garrow's attorney argued manipulation and fabrication. Aldrich listened to the argument with complete patience and then asked the attorney to point to a single specific discrepancy between Maeve's documents and the bank's own records. The attorney could not. Aldrich sentenced Garrow and Marshall Deaver to hard labor at the territorial prison. Garrow for fraud, record tampering, false imprisonment, and conspiracy in the matter of her father's death, Deaver for filing false legal instruments, and abuse of his office. He read the sentences in a flat, measured voice and moved immediately to the next matter. Gertrude and Donald were stripped of all assets derived from Garrow's fraudulent debt arrangement, which was most of what they had, and ordered out of the territory within 30 days. Gertrude sat through the reading of that order with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the table. She didn't look at Maeve. Maeve didn't look at her either. Not because she was being cold, but because there was nothing left there that required her attention. The store and land were returned to Maeve in full, title clear, debt discharged. Outside the hotel afterward, Reuben put his hand on her shoulder for a moment and said, "Your father would have been very proud." He walked away before she could respond, which she appreciated, because she needed a minute. She stood on the hotel porch in the winter sun with the title document in her hands and took that minute. Then Gideon came out and stood beside her. Not too close, looking at the street. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked. She'd been thinking about that for a while. "Run it as a store," she said. "But the back room, I want to open it up. Reading and arithmetic classes 2 mornings a week for women who need them." She looked at the document. Half the women in this territory have been in the same position I was, or close to it. Because they couldn't read a contract or audit a ledger, someone took advantage. She paused. "I want to change that. 1 woman at a time if I have to." He was quiet for a moment. "The name?" he asked. She looked up at the store across the street. She could see the old sign from here, weathered and faded. Her father's name on it, half washed out by 3 winters. "Thorn and Blackwood Trading Post," she said. "If you're agreeable." He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, quiet, certain, completely unguarded. "I'm agreeable," he said. Spring came back to Rock Ridge the way it always did, slowly at first, then all at once. March was mud and false starts, the snow retreating up the mountain slopes, but sending cold water down through every creek and gully. April was the real thing, green, pushing up through the brown fields, the cottonwoods along the creek, putting out their first pale leaves. The mornings finally carrying warmth instead of just the threat of it. By May, Blackwood Ranch had been rebuilt. The new barn was bigger than the old one, with better ventilation along the roof ridge and a stone foundation that would outlast everyone who built it. 4 men from town had come out in March to help frame it up, showing up on a Saturday without being asked, bringing tools and lunches and their oldest work clothes, and they'd stayed 2 days. Gideon had fed them and paid them fair wages and didn't make a speech about it. The house had needed less work, the fire hadn't reached it. But Maeve had repainted the porch rail and replaced 2 windows that had cracked in the February blizzard. And she'd put in a proper kitchen garden on the south side where the light was good. Tomatoes, beans, 2 long rows of potatoes, herbs along the fence. The store in town was a different building than the one she'd left. The back room now had 4 long tables, 2 chalkboards, and a shelf of donated books that had grown from 6 volumes to almost 40 since she'd put the word out in February. The classes ran Tuesday and Thursday mornings, 8 o'clock to 10. The first week she'd had 3 women. By April, she had 11, ranging from a girl of 15, whose family couldn't afford the school fees, to a widow of 50, who had spent 30 years letting other people manage her money and was done with that arrangement. She taught them what her father had taught her: where the money is, how to read a contract, how to audit a ledger and spot a false entry, how to write clearly enough that a judge would understand what they'd written. She told them plainly, on the first morning of every new session, literacy and understanding numbers were not luxuries. They were protection. A person who could read the document in front of them could not be told it said something it didn't. A person who understood the figures in a ledger could not be handed a fraudulent debt and made to believe it was real. They learned fast. People who needed something always did. The wedding was on a Saturday in early May, late afternoon, in the yard behind the store. It was not a large affair. There was no printed invitation, no formal announcement in the territorial paper, no hired musicians. Reuben married them because he had the justice of the peace credential and because nobody else in Rock Ridge would have been the right choice. About 30 people came, the Tuesday, Thursday women and their families, the mill workers who'd stood on the saloon porch that night, the men who'd helped frame the barn, a few others who'd become something like neighbors over the past months. Someone brought a fiddle. Someone else brought 2 pies and a ham, and the whole thing turned into a supper without anyone organizing it. Maeve wore her mother's dress, which she'd found in the bottom of the storage chest at the store, wrapped in brown paper and cedar. It fit well enough. She didn't fuss over the rest. Gideon wore his good coat and a clean shirt and looked like a man who was taking a thing seriously. They stood together in front of Reuben and the assembled company of people who had decided, one way or another, that they were on the same side, and they said the words. Simple ones. Reuben didn't go in for flourishes. Afterward, there was food and the fiddle and the particular easy noise of people who were genuinely glad to be somewhere. Maeve stood at the edge of the yard as the light went gold, watching the party, a cup of coffee in her hands. The mountains were clear above the valley, the snow still bright on the upper peaks, the sky deepening from blue to something almost copper in the west. She thought about the woodshed, the cold, the scratched figures on the log, the lamp she'd kept low so no one would see the light. She thought about the night she'd found the payment record with her father's name on it and understood, finally, the full shape of what had been done. She thought about Gideon standing in the doorway of the woodshed with a blanket. She had been so far down in those years not broken, because she'd never let herself break, but pressed flat like a page held under a stone for a long time. It took a particular kind of patience to keep building something in the dark when you couldn't see who, if anyone, was going to receive it. She'd kept building. That was the part she was proudest of. Gideon came up beside her and stood there for a moment looking at the same view. Then he moved behind her and wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands covering hers around the coffee cup. She leaned back against him, and they stood like that in the last of the golden light, looking west over the open range, the valley green below them, the mountains holding steady above. "You're not thinking about ledgers right now, are you?" he said, quiet near her ear. She smiled, a little. He laughed, low and real, and she felt it move through him. "Next week," he said. "Ledgers next week." She turned her head slightly. "The party?" went on behind them, the fiddle running through something bright and fast. The voices of people who'd found their way to the same yard on the same evening and decided to make something of it together. He pressed his lips to her temple, brief and certain. A real family, he said, isn't built on bloodlines or forced debts. It's built on respect, forgiveness, and equal love between human beings. She looked out at the valley, at the new barn catching the last light, at the garden she'd planted in good soil, at everything still ahead. I know, she said. She did. Maeve Thorne didn't start with power. She started with cold water, cracked hands, and a locked door. She started with people who looked at her and saw something to be used, not someone to be respected. And for 3 years, she endured it. Not because she was weak, because she was building, quietly, carefully, in the dark, by lamplight, one column of numbers at a time. That's the first thing this story is really about. Knowledge is not a luxury. It is armor. Maeve's father taught her that a person who understands money cannot be lied to as easily, and he was right. The moment she could read a ledger, she could read the lie inside it. The moment she understood the figures, she could build the case that set her free. Garrow had the land, the guns, the corrupt marshal, and the manufactured debt. But he didn't have what she had. He couldn't take what lived inside her mind. No one could. That's not a small thing. That's everything. The second thing this story asks you to sit with is this: silence is not the same as acceptance. Maeve never believed the world they built around her was right. She never stopped questioning it. She just knew the difference between the moment to speak and the moment to gather. There is a kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't throw the first punch or make the grand speech. It sits in a freezing woodshed and scratches numbers into a log, because even then, it refuses to stop thinking. That quiet, steady refusal that is its own form of resistance. And it is powerful beyond what anyone who underestimates it will ever understand. The third thing is about what real respect looks like between two people. Gideon Blackwood didn't ride in and solve Maeve's problems for her. He gave her a warm room, a door she could close, and the space to become herself again at her own pace. When she found the fraud in his own accounts, he didn't dismiss her. Give me 2 days. He sent her to the witness stand and sat down because he understood that her voice was the one that needed to be heard. He stepped back, not out of weakness, but out of genuine respect for her independence. That is what equality looks like in practice, not a speech about it. The actual thing. Two people standing on the same ground, contributing what they have, neither one diminished by the presence of the other. And then there's the community that formed around all of it, the mill workers who came out of the saloon and just stood there, the men who showed up on a Saturday to help frame the new barn without being asked, the women who came to those Tuesday and Thursday morning classes and learned to read a contract for the first time in their lives. None of them were heroes in the traditional sense. They were just people who decided at the right moment to be on the right side. And that decision, multiplied across enough people, is what changes a town. What changes anything? So if you take one thing from Maeve's story, let it be this. The truth is patient. Evidence doesn't expire. A case built carefully in the dark will still hold in the light. And the people who try to win by controlling what you know, what you can read, what you're allowed to understand, they are always, eventually, undone by exactly the thing they tried to suppress. Your mind is the one thing that belongs entirely to you. What you do with it is the whole story. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and situations depicted are entirely imaginary and do not represent any real persons or historical events.